So
Yeah.
equity isn't equality. It's not the same thing, but it's often confused together. Explain the difference.
Equity is the idea that that we need to treat people differently in order to arrive at the same level of representation, in order to arrive at a desired representation. So equality says we're just going to treat you on the basis of your merits. We're going to give you equal opportunity. We're going to give you an opportunity to succeed, but if there is a racial discrepancy in the final outcome of a population, then that is okay. Just like, for example, in the NBA, we have an equal playing field. But some people are just going to be better at dribbling, and some people are going to be better at shooting, and they're going to rise to the top. And it just so happens that 75% of the people who rise to the top in the NBA are black. And that is not an unjust outcome. That is a fair outcome. But equity would say that that's unfair because we need to ensure equal outcomes and treat people differently. Under an equity regime, and no one would say this, but there would be people who would say, well, we need more white people or we need more Asian people in the NBA because Asian people are underrepresented in the NBA. They only make up less than 1% of the NBA. We need to find a way to make Asians 6% of the NBA population. Or we need to find a way to make white people 60% of the NBA population because they're 60% of the country. That's really what equity is. And so they would apply principles and policies of racial preferences in the NBA system to to force people of certain races into the NBA.
What are going to bring out for me a little bit some of the broader ramifications of this assault on meritocracy that we're seeing, that you document?
If we aren't able to nurture homegrown talent, if we aren't able to nurture homegrown talent in America to be able to compete at the highest level and the world stage, America will quickly find itself as supplanted, a country supplanted by the likes of China, by the likes of India, by the likes of countries that have no qualms about race and those kinds of things, and are able to train their technocratic elite in such a way. And so, right now we have a tech competition with China, and we need the best engineers, right here in our home. But now if we're discriminating against the best qualified people to go to the best resourced universities and get hired into the best, companies, then we are, eliminating the training ground for our best and brightest to really succeed and have opportunity in this country. And then I would just ask you, the ordinary American, when you go and get surgery for your kneecap or you get surgery for your heart, do you want a surgeon of a certain race or do you want the best qualified surgeon? And what happens at these medical schools is that they are eliminating meritocracy in favor of racial identity politics. And so, you have an Asian American who is a tenth as likely to get, even with higher MCAT and GPAs, they're a tenth as likely to get into these prominent medical schools as you do, if you were black or African American, or even less likely than if you were white. And so when you penalize achievement, you're going to eventually sacrifice the quality of care, in your surgery and elsewhere in the country as well.
So you dedicate a chapter in your book to the New York public school system, specifically these specialized schools where admission is purely based on entrance exam, or at least that's how it's been in the past. Mm-hmm. And there's one example which I thought was really fascinating. The school in Brooklyn, I believe in the 80s, had something like 55% Black and Hispanic students. But since that time, that's basically declined down to something like 4% in the current day. Mm-hmm. And so what actually prompted this change?
In the 60s and the 70s, you had a large proportion of New York City, which has always been, a highly Black and Hispanic city, but you had a large proportion of the city, Black Americans, who were high achieving from elementary school to on the middle school level and then gotten through the high school level. But something in between the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s prompted this drastic slide in Black and Hispanic representation at these high schools. And what happened was in the 90s, in the late 80s, early 90s, there was this movement against gifted and talented programs. They thought that gifted and talented programs in New York City, progressive educators thought that gifted and talented programs in New York City would privilege certain students, the wealthy and the powerful, and so they sought to get rid of gifted and talented programs in New York City. And as a result, the number of gifted and talented middle schools and the number of programs of gifted and talented achievement in the middle schools went down drastically. Over half of them were cut in the 90s and 2000s. And as a result, the pipeline of gifted Black and Hispanic achievement in New York City went down. Also, in New York City, you had this rise in this epidemic in grade inflation in New York City public schools, where a lot of these teachers and a lot of these professors would seek to pass students, even though all standardized metrics would suggest they wouldn't pass. So at one middle school that I covered in my book, you had 85%, 90% pass rates at these middle schools with 12 to 30% pass rates on the corresponding math exam. So you had the result of all of this failed policy was that Black and Hispanic achievement, in this public school system, in this New York City system, started to become superseded by Asian achievement in this system.
And so why the disproportionate impact on Black and Hispanic students?
Because the public school system in New York City, that the city had grown, that so many Black and Hispanic residents had come to rely on, failed them. It failed them. Because of this great inflation, because of the death of gifted and talented programs in New York City, it wasn't the money. The money per pupil, per student kept increasing, but it was poor disciplinary, poor teaching, and all of these other factors that combined. All the while, you had Asian immigrants move into the city, and they were poor too. And in fact, Asians have the highest poverty rate in New York City. Out of all of the racial groups. That's something people don't generally know. Yet, they were able to continue their achievement throughout the years because they were less reliant upon the public school system to address all of their educational needs. Their parents would spend what limited savings they would have to send their kids to extracurricular programs and to do the requisite work to be able to become proficient and advanced. And so as a result, you had Asians who were studying over the weekends and after school to be able to achieve, and eventually they did.
So we have this situation where the policies that are intended to help are actually hurting the people they are intending to help.
When the New York City government decided to implement this death of gifted and talented programs proposal in New York City, what happened was that there are a lot of smart Black kids in New York City, a lot of smart Black and Hispanic kids of high intelligence. I was able to interview several of them. But you can't just be smart. You also have to have the opportunity to be able to achieve at the level in which you can be sufficiently challenged. And so what happened was you had these smart Black Americans who were not able to be put into a program at the elementary and middle school level that that challenged them. And so they were at the top of their class, but they were not being taught a challenging curriculum. They were being forced back down into the middle of the student body. And oftentimes the culture at some of these underperforming schools is that academic achievement is resented, and you're seen as acting white. You're seen as being an Uncle Tom. You know, I saw this from my own friends who are black, who are African American, who have told me that because, you know, they dared to academically achieve, you know, they were treated with homosexual slurs, you know, they were called Uncle Toms, everything like that. And so if you are not able to build a culture where people are challenged at the level where they're challenged, you waste that intellect, you waste that intelligence of those people. And so for the sake of equity, we are dumbing down the best and brightest of our next generation. And so that's why you see this huge slide in Black and Hispanic representation at these gifted and talented high schools in New York City.